So, yeah, my name's Geoff Revill, and what I want to talk to you today is about the culture and technological approach to building a company that we believe can be fundamentally trustworthy. A lot of people talk about trust, but I don't like the word trust in the way in which I want to see a future internet evolve, because somehow or other it comes down to a question with a binary answer, yes or no, and that's massively insufficient to really define what trust is. What really should be happening is companies and organizations should be trying to think through how they're going to build the next generation of products to make a better internet, and to do that, we have to build our companies to be fundamentally trustworthy. So I want to take you through the thought process that we went through trying to get to that point. But just before we do that, I just want to start off with a legislative context. I'm not a legal person, I'm a technologist, but I've been studying the GDPR, and there are some things I absolutely love about it. These are most of them. They fundamentally re-empower individuals in the engagement process, and I would encourage every company that wants to change the internet to find ways to help the average citizen understand these new rights that they have, because I think this is the way in which we're going to change the internet. But I also say that when it comes down to inculcating culture inside an organization, the principles that underpin the GDPR are far more important than the legislation itself. In fact, actually, perversely, if you think about it, the law is just a codification of a set of principles, and when they do that, it's done imperfectly. What we should be doing is going back to what was the GDPR trying to do when it created itself. And there are actually, under the Data Protection Act, 9 basic principles. I'm not going to go through them because that's not what the presentation's about, but I encourage you to look into them. And of course, under the GDPR, there's a new one, it's called accountability, and that one is really important. And that's what's going to help us change the way in which companies can become trustworthy in the future. But before I go into that, I'm going to take another step back and just say, let's go through a few basic definitions, because if we don't go through these basic definitions, we don't really have a common understanding of what it is we're trying to build. So I'm going to go through security, privacy, and trust in a digital, all of these in a digital engagement context. I'm going to say something a little bit controversial. Bottom line, as far as the future is concerned, as far as personal data is concerned, security doesn't really exist. Time is the great undoer. I talk sometimes in presentations about cognitive dissonance. Bottom line is the information we exchange today we think is secured and protected. Once it's been around long enough, will get accessed by somebody somewhere in an inappropriate fashion. The real consequence accrues to the individual. And cybersecurity is fundamentally, it's just an arms race. It's how fast can I build my wall to stop the hacker getting over the wall? And it's a race we're all going to lose at some point. So trust, while it's a foundational building block, security, while it's a foundational building block for trust, you can't rely upon it, because we know it's going to get lost at some point, because we're going to get breached. We're all going to get breached at some point. Talk about privacy for a second. I actually ask people who talk about privacy and say, what is privacy? And actually, it doesn't matter who you ask, you'll get a different definition, because they'll all come at it from multiple different perspectives. They'll come at it from the point of view of context. I'll share this with that person in that situation, but not that information to that person in a different context. Principle, the way they think about a principle can be very different across cultural divides. The way the law in America and Europe interprets the way in which privacy can be inculcated is different. The value I put on it. If you talk to, there's millions of studies out there. There are plenty of people I speak to who say, my own brother, in fact, says, I don't care. I can have everything I don't care what they know about me. Whereas I've got other people who sit there and go, the government wants to know everything about me, and, I hate them, and I need to protect myself from them. Facebook is the devil. And you have those broad spectrum everywhere between those things. The culture of a company, culture of a country will change, and the way in which we implement things, all of these things do it. But the one thing we can all tend to agree on, what I tend to find is when I engage with people and say, what we can do is we can all agree when privacy is breached. And privacy is breached when the information I provide, explicitly or implicitly, metadata or actual data, is used for a purpose other than that for which I understood it to be provided. That's when privacy is breached. And we keep that in mind. When I talk to my engineers, that's what privacy is all about, is making sure that we have that communication with people. So yes, that inculcates consent and a bunch of other things like that, but it's broader than that. It's about this fundamental contract of agreement between me as the provider of a service and you as a consumer of it. But really, we come back to a very simple overriding privacy principle. Just treat all the personal data and metadata as belonging to the customer. We're only temporary custodians. We're privileged with the right to use your information to provide you a service. And thank you very much for that. Keep that in mind as an overriding principle for privacy. So let's talk about trust for a second. So let's talk, what is trust? Well, again, trust is contextual somewhat. In a social context, it's an attitude of confident expectation that one's vulnerabilities will not be exploited. In other words, when I share stuff with you, I'm making myself vulnerable to you, and I'm confident, I'm trusting that you're not going to exploit those in ways that I didn't think you were going to do. In a business context, it's about the value exchange. Is it fair? Is it equitable? And this is the one I want to add in here, because this is an important one that most businesses don't like to talk about. And if I lose that trust, does it drive an equivalent and proportional consequence on both me as an individual and you as a business? How many times have we seen breaches in the media being talked about, and they spend loads of time talking about the share price dip and the consequence of the company and the amount of money they had to spend to recover from, this massive breach that they'd had, and it's all focused around the security. And then eventually you might hear at some later date some consequences to the individual. It might get mentioned that in some cases, and there have been, suicides that have occurred because of the intrusion upon somebody's personal data and information they never wanted exchanged. And yet that somehow doesn't get the headlines that the corporates get. Doesn't seem quite right to me. So what's missing? Well, the way I look at things, trust is more important than privacy, and privacy is more important than security. So these are the sort of building blocks. But in the middle of there, it's really about the empowerment process. So how are we going to engage, create a digital engagement model that's truly empowering to the individual? So you have to build trust in as a company and product value. So it's an internal issue. What's the culture of the organization I'm going to build? How am I going to foster trust? And then it's an external issue. How do I build that into my product? These are similar, but not the same things. And I like to think of when we get to this point where companies generally rate themselves, like our friends here from Digital Ranking, on how well they achieve trust in the marketplace. That's when the internet grows up from being a teenager, a bit of an adolescent, doing all sorts of naughty things, which we know it's doing, to a young adult that begins to take on real responsibilities for what it's up to. So seek to be trustworthy, because trust is not an absolute. It's a continuous battle. We're always going to be fighting for it. You've got to really look inside your organization and say, how do we become worthy of the trust of every single one of our customers, and make that a daily activity, a daily routine. So this is the pinnacle of what we should be trying to achieve. But what is trust? We need to break it down. We've heard a lot of talk today about the issues of control, and I completely agree with those. We need to give people control. What is control? The Mydata program talks a lot about people. I've heard this morning people talking about this idea that individuals should be given all access to all of their data so they can manage it. Well, frankly, I don't actually believe that they will, because most of them don't care enough. But they do care about trust, which is very perverse. It's a bit like the privacy paradox. You've got a trust paradox. They want to trust companies. They do trust companies. But then they're doing it in a manner that sort of says, well, I haven't actually checked you out or validated you. So the control should be a function of both the UI and the UX. In fact, frankly, the UX, the user experience, is far more important about giving people control. It just becomes inculcated to the way in which the product engages with you. And yes, you should be absolutely transparent. And with our product, and I haven't talked about it, I will briefly mention it later on, but with our product, we publish on our website every single piece of data and metadata that we collect about an individual, and we isolate and determine what security we apply to each of those elements of data as well. And we define the key elements of how we do the security as well, like how we secure the data at rest, and how we secure the data on the move, and how we secure the data on the device. The thing that most people don't spend an awful lot of time on is this last bit, remedy. In broad papers that I've read, they tend to use the word accountability. I was very pleased to see, actually, our guys here from Digital Ranking Digital Rights, talked about remedy. And I agree with that, because accountability, unfortunately, tends to get interpreted as this idea that somehow or other, as long as we're within the confines of the law, we're operating perfectly appropriately for fostering trust. No. The law is a very low bar, very low bar. It's easy to step over it, and frankly, I'm afraid to say most of the lawyers, and I'm sorry to anybody in this room, they're probably not these types of lawyers, most of our lawyers in the privacy context spend most of their time doing risk mitigation on behalf of their corporate client. They're not doing compliance assurance on the behalf of the customer. And that imbalance needs to be reset. So how do you go about doing that reset? Well, interestingly, the GDPR brings some very important powers in there. The right to delete and the right to data portability. Don't put these things into your legal policy buried somewhere deep. Bring it out to the front end of your product. In our application, it's 2 clicks to delete all your data. It's your data. If you want to delete it, delete it. We'd be upset because you're devaluing our product, but you know what? It's yours. If you want to export it, 3 clicks. There you go. Have it all. Take it away. And once we get these nice interoperability frameworks, we'll comply with those because it's your data, not mine. Why is it not going? I'm pressing the wrong one. There we go. So let's now, the most of that is about the external side. So looking back to the internal side and what you need to inculcate inside your organization. What am I doing for time? Okay. We identified these 5 key areas. Now, privacy by design, it's referenced by the GDPR, it's not required. What I'll say about this is if you absolutely follow privacy by design, what you'll end up with, we've got a social platform, is a social platform with no privacy settings. I'd like to say, if you have privacy settings, you failed in privacy. Because it should be in reverse. We should be having sharing settings, not privacy settings. That's what we should be looking at. So that's privacy by design. Secure by design, that's much more simple and basic, but what I would say is, if you haven't considered and mapped out and planned your security before you write your first line of code, you've already failed. You have to have an absolute commitment to no covert profiling or tracking. And you have to make this kind of almost sort of central to the way that you think, because the internet has inculcated this idea that everything you do is something for me to store away, put it into my big database, and at some later date, leverage the value of that. And that storage activity, that temporal displacement activity that's going on, that's putting our customers at risk. If you don't need it, don't take it. So with the open business model, be really clear about exactly how you're going to be making money, because it will be leveraged from the data, very much so. If you're not clear and you don't document this, a lot of apps, and we're one of them, are going to be free for a long time, and then we'll monetize. If we're not clear before we start to monetize, then we're being dishonest. And there's an awful lot of that kind of activity that's gone on in America. But the one that tends to get ignored or not noticed most is user data minimization. I'd like to say this is perhaps one of the most important, because we know we can't secure all the data all the time, so we better damn well not take it if we don't absolutely need it. And in fact, we should be innovating to store the very least we can get away with. So when you put all these things together, what you end up with is what we like to call our trust pyramid. And it's a model for trustworthy digital engagement. This is what I'd like to leave or bequeath to this organization, is these concepts and ideas presented very simply in a way that any engineering community and software development community and business community inside a company can look at and adopt and agree with. Just want to mention how we use that data minimization process is that we wanted to open up location engagement opportunity and value, and we realized location data was incredibly creepy and scary information. So we said, how do we enable location-based engagement without location data? How do we get rid of location data? And that's how we innovated, and we created something which we called co-location technology. So if you want to know anything more, there's more on my blog, on our CrowdThink page. And thank you very much. Any questions?